This is U.S. History 2, Chapter 7, Section 2, Trench Warfare and U.S. Involvement in World War I. So the last time where we picked up from where we left off, war has started. Germany tried the Schlieffen Plan. They got across into France from Belgium, but they were stopped by a combined force of French and British army, and they both dug in. So, where the Battle of the Marne, where France and Britain are, that's the Western Front. That's the 400-mile battle line in France and Belgium. And then you have the Eastern Front. This is where Russia is. So this is very long line, the Eastern Front, but it kind of extends all the way down like this, separating Germany and Austria-Hungary from Russia. This is just showing you more like the line. It kind of ebbs and flows as the wars and as people press in and out. This one, the Western Front, stayed pretty much the same. Moved a little bit, but this is where you have, in the Eastern Front, you have big sweeping advances in Russia. So after the Battle of Marne, both sides dug in. They were at a stalemate, both deadlocked. They were building these trenches. No one could gain any ground. But while no one could gain any ground, they were both building this network of trenches. And then this led to trench warfare. And the Western Front became just battles of trench warfare tactics. And that's soldiers fire from one side of the trench to the opposing trench. And then sometimes they leave their trenches to go charge the other opposing enemy trenches. Hopefully they can remove them from the trench. But these new deadly weapons forced both sides to use trench warfare. Just charge like the Civil War, like just charging at an enemy head on and just like using brute force to push them off of territory. It just doesn't happen when you have machine guns that can just take out dozens of men in a second. Full frontal attacks just weren't successful against such advanced weaponry. And they discovered this pretty quickly in the World War I, that the old tactics just didn't work with modern weaponry. And then soldiers used trenches as defense and protection against such devastating weapons. They needed protection against these, this form of, there's artillery and everything like that. You can't just charge at them. So you need some kind of base. But the conditions in the trenches were terrible. They're wet, cold, muddy, rat-infested, smelled, and there was always the constant threat of death, because if you poked your head out, you might get shot. So you got to stay under cover at all times. So here they are. They're just dug in. This guy's tired. The Germans and the Allies, they were just entrenched in these ditches. All right, so if both sides have this strong defensive position in these trenches, then you need to start developing some weapons to get your enemy out of their trench. So you had to cross this no man's land. That was the area between the trenches. If you would go into it, you'd be killed pretty much immediately. Both sides had guns pointed in the middle of no man's land. And fighting from the trenches led both sides to invent a new and improved way of attacking. Tanks, if you can roll across no man's land with a tank and be protected, that's one way of crossing it. These are some of the earliest tanks, pretty successful, and they were first used in World War I. A tank offered protection from gunfire, and you could move from one trench to another. They were pretty successful, but they were still pretty clumsy because they were the first tanks. So you can see here, so you have two sets. So this is a trench line. So this is no man's land. These are your network of trenches. That's your first line. Then it goes into this other network. Here's a base. You might have a machine gun there. Your artillery's firing from the back. And see how that's just a wasteland. So this is where the soldiers would be, and then that's your firing position. Here's the machine gun. They'd have obstacles like barbed wire, so if people they couldn't cross easily. It's all about fortifying your position. Other new weapons, hand grenades. You could throw them, blow up the enemy. That they were first used in World War One. Airplanes. They finally became, like we said in earlier chapters, the Wright brothers. They invented the airplane, but really wasn't until World War One did they really discover how awesome these things were, and they improved greatly during World War One. If you ever heard of the Red Baron, that's a German pilot. He flew this red plane. He shot down a lot of Allied forces planes, airplanes. And then when they fight in the sky, airplanes, they were called dogfights. But they would also be used to scout enemy positions, because if you're in the trench, you really can't see. You're not high where your enemy is in all their positions, but planes can see that. But the most feared weapon during the war was the use of poison gas. And the Germans were the first to use the poison gas during the war. What they would do is they release canisters, and they would launch them into the enemy trenches, and it would disperse this poison gas. It was so effective immediately, and then the Allied forces quickly copied it and were sending it back over to the Germans. And these poison gases, when released, what kind of damage it would inflict? Well, it caused choking to death. You just cough and you can't breathe. That's chlorine gas. There's burning eyes and blindness, agonizing burning and blistering. That's mustard gas. Eventually, soldiers would be issued gas masks to protect them from these poison attacks. It was just terrible. It was really tricky when you release these, because you had to have the wind blowing in the right direction, blowing towards your enemy. And so, but it was just a very brutal tactic. But it was successful. But these gas masks, once everybody stood up with them, it did help. And then flamethrowers were the first used in World War I, and they were to remove soldiers from their positions. Pretty much everybody runs away if someone's shooting flames at you. So there's flamethrowers here. There's the gas mask, and that's kind of the canisters being released into enemy territory. So moving on to the United States. Since the beginning of the war, the United States were determined to not pick a side and remain neutral. They kind of believed that this was a war in Europe. The United States kind of wanted to stay out of it. Americans were divided about this, because a lot of American families have lived in the United States for generations. They favored the Allied forces, French. The British are kind of like our allies. Americans who are of German or Austrian descent, they kind of favor the Central Powers, because they had relatives living in Germany or Austria-Hungary, so they're kind of close to their beliefs. And then the Irish Americans, they favored the Central Powers for the blunt fact that they hated England so bad, and they because of England's dominance over Ireland, so they remember the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So Irish definitely didn't like the English, so they took a side with the Germans. So England tried to convince the Americans to support the Allied forces by using propaganda. And what propaganda is the spread of information designed to win support for a cause. Most of British propaganda was focused on portraying Germany as the enemy, and many of the British claims about the Germans being brutal were just false. So the British were releasing all this pamphlets, posters to Americans, trying to gain support for the Allied forces, and a lot of it just weren't true. So this is kind of one of their typical ones: come across, help us. But this is how they would portray the Germans as beasts, as these crazy people. They need to be stopped as the enemy. They're just terrible people. They're snakes. You don't want the German influence around. So American businesses were allowed to supply both sides. They could supply the Allied or the Central Powers. American businesses were allowed to trade with both the Allied and Central Powers. But most of the trade was going to England and France just because trade between them was always strong, going back to the colonies. So that was just a natural trade partner. Um, Germany was noticing that the trade was mostly going to England and France, and so they used these U-boats that were submarines. They're called U-boats because it's in German it's Unterseeboot, which is just mean like an undersea, boat. That's really all that means. But they were using these submarines to block um, any kind of supplies going to the Allies, including some American ships. They'd be like, "Hey, turn around! We got torpedoes." Blah blah blah. So this is a German U-boat, and so submarine. It's like the first submarine, or first modern-looking submarine. And they were like, and the ships did not have the sonar and the detection to see where they were at, like future wars. So they were really easy. They were really sneaky, and they were able to sink ships really easily. So German U-boats sank in May 7th, 1915. German U-boats sank the British passenger ship off the coast of Ireland called the Lusitania. Um, Germans believed that the ship was carrying goods, not just passengers. They believed that it was carrying war supplies from the United States. 1,200 passengers were killed, and 128 Americans were killed. Americans back in the United States were outraged. President Woodrow Wilson in Germany came to a resolution that no more passenger ship would be sunk. So Germany was kind of like, my bad. We thought it was full of war supplies, which probably was. But Germany did not want the United States going into the war, and neither did Woodrow Wilson. He didn't want to jump into this war either. So they came to an agreement: no more passenger ships would be sunk. So United States kind of backed off, and they didn't enter the war at this time. So this is the Lusitania. See how German U-boat wouldn't come close, fire a torpedo, it would explode it, and then it's sunk. So a lot of Americans wanted to go to war, but Woodrow Wilson is determined to keep the United States out of it because he just hears these horrific things that are happening. All these men dying, so high casualties. We don't want to get involved in this. Woodrow Wilson was elected to a second term, largely because he was able to keep the United States out of war. Wilson pleaded with both Allied and Central Powers to stop the fighting. He wanted peace without victory, and pretty much what this means is that he wanted both the Allied and the Central Powers to come to an agreement to have peace without one victorious over the other and taking advantage and reaping the spoils of war, because that would just end terribly in Europe. So Wilson wanted peace in Europe really badly. And does everybody just play along and be nice? But then in 1917, a telegram, which is its coded message, was intercepted by the British. And it was a telegram from German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to Mexico. And what this telegram message sent is it wanted Mexico to attack the United States. In return, Germany would help Mexico take back New Mexico, Texas, and Arizona land. The telegram is known as the Zimmermann note. And once the British showed the United States this, the United States was like, oh boy, Germans are just asking for it. So by 1917, Germans are kind of like, okay, you saw the note, whatever. We're just going to start sinking U.S. merchant ships too. We're gonna try. The United States is probably going to go to war anyways. So, but this is what the telegram. So, it's a coded message. You have to decode it. But they were able to decode it, and that's what it said. It said, you attack the United States, we'll help you get back this land. We're all good, because Germany was feeling that the United States is going to enter the war sooner or later. And then Russia was one of the three. Then this happened, the Russian Revolution. And a little backstory: Russia was one of the three major countries that made up the Allied forces. Russia was ruled by a tyrant monarch, Tsar Nicholas II. He's like a king. A czar is like a king. Really, the word czar comes from the word Caesar, and that's a old term for a leader in Italy back in the Roman Empire. So anyways, Tsar Nicholas was seen as an enemy of the Russian people. He mistreated them. He wasn't really in touch with the Russian people, and he limited their rights. He was an absolute ruler, and the Russian people just didn't want that anymore. But one of the reasons why the United States didn't want to join the war is because they didn't want to join the Allied forces that had Russia. Like, we don't really like Russia. We don't want to support their cause and everything like that. So we're just going to stay out of it. We believe that Russia should have democracy. We really don't want to support anybody that doesn't have democracy, which is people who have the power in government. We want to support this dictator pretty much. So the Russian people had enough mistreatment from the Tsar and began a revolution, which is a radical change in society. The people had enough. So they overthrew Tsar Nicholas. Part of the reason why they overthrew Tsar Nicholas is because they were tired of losing all these soldiers against the Germans, because the Russian military was ill-prepared, and it was just this war that they didn't want to get into. So the Russian revolutionaries assassinated Tsar Nicholas and the entire royal family at the Winter Palace. So the movie Anastasia is based on this theory that one of Tsar Nicholas's children were spared or were able to escape being executed that night in the Winter Palace, and they were able to get away. So that's the whole theory behind Anastasia, and that she grew up and that she's secretly a princess. So after the Russian Revolution in 1917, a new Russian government came to power. Russia pulled out of the war and no longer was involved in the fighting. So Russia had a revolution. They're not involved in the fighting anymore. And then now the United States had no more reasons not to join the war and support the Allies. Russia's out. Germany's is provoking us with these telegrams and sinking our ships. It's time to go to war. So the reasons, like I just said, sinking of the ships by U.S. ships by German U-boats, the Zimmermann telegram, the Russian Revolution, we don't have to join up with them anymore. All right, it's time to go to war. And so the U.S. declares war on April 2nd, 1917. Woodrow Wilson asked Congress to declare war. They did, against Germany and Austria-Hungary, and Congress gave the approval, and the United States is at war. This concludes Chapter 7, Section 2.